Little Miss Mouse by Amy Ella Blanchard. Chapter 3. Henrietta's Red Coat. For a long time after this, Henrietta was neglected, and the striped pocket lay unheeded in the box of pieces, for Stray was the absorbing interest to both Ruth and Billy. Generous little Billy had declared the puppy must belong half to Ruth, and therefore she always went with him when, tin pail in hand, he called at the different houses where the promised scraps were to be collected. Sometimes, the scraps which the other puppies left were few, but there was always enough for the not-too-fastidious appetite of Stray, or, if it seemed a very slim supper, both Ruth and Billy cheerfully set aside a portion of theirs. Consequently, Stray throve and grew apace. Miss Hester confessed that he was great company for her while the children were at school, and he came to consider her as close a friend as Ruth or Billy. Before winter came on, the Major's old overcoat was fashioned into a warm one for Billy and for Ruth. Miss Hester contrived comfortable frocks from her discarded ones, but there was no coat for her, till one day Ruth discovered Miss Hester bending over an old chest in the attic. The tiny house held but 4 rooms below and the attic above. One end of the attic was curtained off for a room for Billy. The rest was stored with chests and bandboxes, trunks, and old furniture. It was rather a fearsome place to Ruth, that dark end of the attic, though she did venture in there once in a while when she was hiding from Billy. Now, however, Stray could always find her so that it was no longer any fun to hide there. Upon this particular day, she had a message from Miss Amanda Beach and was in a hurry to deliver it lest she forget it. "Aunt Hester, Aunt Hester," she called, "where are you?" An answer came from the dark end of the attic. "Here, child." Ruth groped her way along the dusky aisles. A spinning wheel's flax brushed her face. An old leghorn bonnet was set swinging from the rafters as she felt her way with uplifted hands, a string of dried peppers, hanging from a beam, caught in her hair. Ruth stood still. "I don't see you," she said anxiously. The peppers had seemed like something alive. "Over here," repeated Miss Hester, standing up, and Ruth saw her figure dimly in the gloom. She picked her way along with more assurance as her eyes became accustomed to the half-light. "Miss Amanda wanted me to be sure to tell you that there is to be a meeting of the mothers this afternoon at the minister's house, and you mustn't forget to come, she says. You are just the same as a mother, Billy's and mine, aren't you, Aunt Hester?" "I hope so," returned Miss Hester, groping among the bundles in the chest, before which she was kneeling. "There, this is what I am looking for." "Oh, what a cunning little hood," said Ruth, picking up a soft cashmere affair trimmed with swan's down. "Was it yours when you were a little girl, Aunt Hester?" "No, all these things belong to my little sister Henrietta. They have been in this chest ever since she died. My mother put them there with her own hands." "Oh." Ruth leaned over to look more closely at the neat piles of garments. Miss Hester sat on the floor and pushed back a lock of hair which had fallen over her eyes. She was a tall, slender woman with dark hair, hazel eyes, and a sad expression about the mouth. "Were they all Henrietta's?" asked Ruth with interest. "Aunt Hester, if you had had a little girl, you would have named her Henrietta, wouldn't you?" Miss Hester smiled. "Very likely. Most everybody calls me Ruth Brackenberry, don't they? Do you like to have them call me that, Aunt Hester?" "Do you?" "I do, if you do," returned Ruth shyly. Then her thoughts turned to Miss Amanda, and she said again, "You are just the same as our mother, Billy's and mine, aren't you?" "I try to be the same as a mother to you." "Then, Aunt Hester, could I be named Ruth Henrietta Brackenberry, and if anybody asks my name, can I tell them it is that?" "Why, my dear," Miss Hester arose and hung over her arm the garment she had taken from the chest. "Yes, if you like." "Would you like?" asked Ruth wistfully. Miss Hester did not answer at once, but picked her way back to where it was lighter. "Try this on," she said, holding out a dark red coat trimmed with fur. Ruth slipped her arms into the sleeves and then softly stroked the fur trimming. "It fits perfectly," said Miss Hester with satisfaction. "So you can wear it Sunday. I will hang it out in the air to get rid of the smell of camphor, and tomorrow I will press out the creases." "For me? For me?" cried Ruth. "Henrietta's coat for me? Oh, Aunt Hester. Yes, for you, and I think all those little clothes will fit you. It will save me many stitches, and what good are they hoarded away?" she said, half to herself. Ruth clasped her arms around Miss Hester's waist. "Please kiss me as if I were Henrietta," she said, "and let me put her name next to mine." Miss Hester stooped to kiss the quivering lips. "I will ask the minister about the name," she answered. "I am not sure whether it would be right, but I'd like it. Yes, I'd like very much for you to have it." "May I wear the coat downstairs?" asked Ruth. "Then you won't have to carry it." "You may wear it down, then take it off and lay it on my bed." "Ruth Henrietta Brackenberry," whispered Ruth to herself as she stepped down the narrow stairs behind Miss Hester, avoiding the plain black skirt which swept each step in front of her. Ruth loved color. Rich clothes and dainty fare likewise appealed to her. It was bitterness to the proud little soul to feel that she had been taken from the streets. She envied the little Henrietta who had been a Brackenberry and who had lived her short life in the fine old house with white pillars. The child felt that in some way she would more fairly possess that little sister's inheritance if she could include Henrietta's name in her own. Little Ruth gave a fierce loyalty to the mother she had loved so dearly, and, though she never failed to stand up for her father and was ready with excuses whenever Billy or any other assailed him, in her inmost heart she felt a bitter rage against the man who had left her and her mother to suffer. She excused him partly because of pride and partly because she knew her mother would wish it. But to herself, she considered that a great injustice had been done and resented bitterly the fact that those who commended Miss Hester for her great charity felt that Ruth and Billy belonged to the same class. Billy did not care what anyone thought. His life had been a hard one from babyhood. He had never been warm in winter, nor had he had enough to eat at any time of year. He had been kicked and battered about from this one to that, till he could not tell to whom he really did belong, so that when he drifted into this haven of peace, he had but one feeling, and that of thankfulness. With Ruth, it was different. She remembered when she had worn pretty clothes, and when a sweet and dainty mother had fed her choice bits from a well-appointed table, when a tall father had taken her to drive behind a gray horse. She remembered, too, a pretty house and garden which had been home to her. She could not recollect how it happened that all changed, but so it did, and, by degrees, the place she and her mother called home became poorer and poorer till a garret, under the eaves of a tall building, was their habitation. When it came to this, there was no father there to see the manner of it, only a pale and sad mother who wept constantly and who coughed often as she sat over a table, writing. After a while, there was less to eat, no fire, and the cough grew worse. Then they took her mother away one morning, after she had lain for hours very pale and still. Ruth could not rouse her. Someone came in and whispered, "She is dead, poor thing." And then Ruth knew what was the matter. In a turmoil of terror and grief, she had rushed down the steps and out into the street. Her mother could not be dead. It needed but a doctor to make her well, and it was a doctor the desperate little child was seeking when she was discovered by a city missionary, exhausted and weeping and weary with wandering. At first, she had repelled all advances from Miss Hester, and had no words even for Billy, but his good nature at last brought a response, and she accepted his companionship, while for Miss Hester there was springing up a deep affection. She was no longer jealous for the mother who had become an angel, for she was fading into a sweet and lovely dream. She no longer resented the fact that Miss Hester had taken her in from charity, for she was beginning to realize that something more than cold duty prompted Miss Hester's kind acts. Today, for the first time, she understood in what light Miss Hester really regarded her. For could she have given to anyone that she did not love the clothing of the long-mourned little twin sister, Henrietta? The child took off the coat, carefully laid it on Miss Hester's bed, then she fingered it gently. It was lined with soft, wadded silk, and in the little pocket was a folded handkerchief. Ruth drew it out and silently held it out to Miss Hester. "You can use that too," Miss Hester told her, and Ruth put it back again. It gave her a truer sense of taking Henrietta's place to know that it was there. She wore the red coat proudly to church the next Sunday, and though at any other time she would have allowed Stray to take such liberties as pleased him, she spoke to him quite sharply when he attempted to jump upon her with not too clean paws. "Proudy," whispered Billy. Ruth shot him a look of defiance from under her black brows. "You'd be proud, too, if you had on Henrietta Brackenbury's coat," she said. "Well, I guess I've got on the Major's," returned Billy triumphantly. "Oh, but it's made over," returned Ruth, as if that settled the question and made all the difference in the world. In fact, so complacent was Ruth in her new rig that, a few days later, her pride had a fall, such a tumble-down as was followed by serious consequences. It was when Lucia Field invited her to a party which was strictly select, it being her birthday. Annie Waite was there as well as Nora Petty, Angeline McBride, and Charlotte Thompson. Ruth was glad to see them all except Nora and Angeline, for these two had never been very agreeable to her at school. Once or twice, Nora had made some little mean remark, which Ruth had overheard, and which had made her very angry. She had told Billy about it, but he only laughed. She had not forgotten, however, and held herself rather loftily when she entered Lucia's house, clad in the red coat and a fine plaid poplin which had been Henrietta's. "Doesn't Ruth look nice?" whispered Annie to Nora. "So," was the reply given with a toss of the head. "I wonder where she got her clothes," said Angeline. "They are kind of old-fashioned, but they are awfully pretty." "She didn't bring 'em with her when she came to town, that's one thing sure," said Nora behind her hand. And Angeline giggled. By this time, Ruth had laid aside her coat and hat in the best bedroom and had stepped down the broad stairway into the room where the other girls were gathered, waiting for the party to begin. Mrs. Field was there, and her cousin, Miss Fanny, a young lady in a blue dress, who smiled invitingly at each of the girls and said they must have some games. Then the fun began, and for an hour or more went steadily forward, Miss Fanny being at the head and front of everything. Then came simple refreshments, homemade cakes, ice cream, and bonbons. Ruth was just thinking that she had never had a better time in her life when Lucia came forward with a birthday book which her cousin Fanny had given her. "Now, before you go," she said, "I want you all to write your names in my birthday book." Ruth's color came and went as she stood waiting her turn. Nora looked at her, nudged Angeline, and giggled. She knew it was an awkward moment for Ruth, though Lucia had not dreamed of such a thing. She really was very fond of Ruth, and admired her much more than she did Nora. Annie and Charlotte had bent themselves to their task. Annie's was a crooked scrawl, slanting unevenly across the page opposite March 12th. Charlotte's signature was very black and round. "Now it is your turn," said Miss Fanny to Ruth. "When is your birthday, dear?" "November the 15th, said Ruth weakly. "Oh," exclaimed Nora. "How do you know?" Ruth bit her lip. Then she made answer. "It is written in my mother's Bible." "Of course," said Miss Fanny. "Right here, dear. You have a nice quotation, too." Ruth hesitated, dipped her pen in the ink, and then wrote quite firmly, "Ruth Henrietta Brackenbury." Oh, cried Nora, looking over her shoulder. "See what she has written. Her name isn't Brackenbury at all, Miss Fanny. People call her that, but her name isn't that at all." It is, cried Ruth, her eyes flashing. "And the Henrietta is for Aunt Hester's little sister. She said so." Miss Fanny, who did not know Ruth's history, looked puzzled. "Why do you say it isn't her name, Nora?" she asked. "Why, because it isn't. Everybody knows Miss Brackenbury took her from charity. She took her out of the streets. My mother was at the meeting when the letter came about her and Billy Beatty, and she said she didn't see how Miss Brackenbury could be willing to take in anyone she didn't know anything about. She wouldn't let me play with her at first, and I don't think she ought to be allowed to call herself something she is not." But before the speech was ended, Ruth had rushed upstairs, with hurried, trembling fingers had put on her hat and coat, and, without stopping for a word with anyone, had flown out of the house and up the street, the tears running down her cheeks and her heart beating with a fierce resentment. Miss Hester was not at home when she arrived at the door, and she was obliged to go around the back way, take the key from its hiding place under the doormat, and let herself in. An hour later, Miss Hester found her alone in the dark, lying prone on the floor, sobbing broken-heartedly. "Why, my poor little girl, what is the matter?" she said, lifting her up. "What has happened? Are you hurt? Has anything happened to Billy or Stray?" No, replied Ruth between sobs. "It's only me." "Only you?" "But only you are very important to your Aunt Hester. I'll take off my things, and then you must come in where it is warm and tell me all about it." Ruth's room was heated from Miss Hester's, where a wood stove supplied the heat night and morning. Now that the weather had grown colder, Miss Hester sat in the living room or the kitchen, for she must save fuel. It was not long before Ruth's tears were dried, as, with head nestled on Miss Hester's shoulder, she sat in her lap and told her story. "It was very unkind of Nora," Miss Hester said. "I suppose she thought I wanted to be deceitful, and she always likes to tell on people. She's always telling on the girls at school the least little thing they do. She didn't like it 'cause the girls said my coat was pretty. She asked me where I got it, and I told her you gave it to me, and she said she wondered how you could afford to give me anything as good as that." She began to say something else, but Lucia hushed her up. "Oh, Aunt Hester, was I deceitful? I am your little girl now. You said so." "Yes, dear, you are my own little girl. You love Aunt Hester a little bit, don't you?" "I love you. Oh, I do love you, but you don't want me to forget Mother, do you?" "1,000 times no. Remember your dear mother to your dying day." "She's an angel now," returned Ruth, "and I can't tell her I love her, but I can tell you, and I want to stay with you forever and ever and be called Ruth Henrietta Brackenbury. And so you shall. I must see Dr. Peasley," she added musingly, "and Squirefield. They'll know how I must make it legal." She put on her hat that very evening and went out, leaving Billy and Ruth to study their lessons. When she came back, Dr. Peasley was with her. He brought a pocket full of roasted chestnuts for the children and told them such funny stories that they went laughing to bed. Sometime later came an important-looking envelope through the mail. Ruth brought it in. "Such a great big letter, Aunt Hester." Miss Hester took it, opened it, and looked over the contents. Then she called Ruth to her. "Ruth Henrietta Brackenbury," she said, taking the child's face between her two hands. "That is your real name now, and no one can dispute it. You shall never change it unless," she added, with a little twist of a smile, "you should get married some day." "But I never shall." returned Ruth soberly, "for I shall always want my name to same as yours. Is it really, really mine?" "It is really yours in law, and you are my own little girl in the eyes of the law, exactly the same as you would be any mother's." "Oh, I am so glad, said Ruth. Then they sat and hugged each other very tight till Billy came in with the wood. Chapter 4. One Friday afternoon. "And what about Billy?" said Ruth. "You are his aunt, too, you know." Ruth looked across the room at the cheerful Billy stowing away the wood for the morning's fire. "You know I am really and truly named Brackenberry for always and forever," said the little girl exultantly. "I know," returned Billy. "It's all right for a girl." Billy is quite content to remain Billy Beatty. He says he would rather not have any other name, and under the circumstances, I think it is just as well, said Miss Hester. "I've always been called Bill Beatty, and I'm always a-going to be," maintained Billy sturdily. "Why, the first week I was here, I licked a feller for calling me something else." "Why, Billy?" said Miss Hester chidingly. "Yes, I did. I didn't tell you nor Ruth neither. 'Twain't no use. You're awful good to me, and I'm tickled to death to call you aunt, not having no kin, but aunts don't always have the same name as their nephews," I told the fellers. "Besides, I ain't just the Brackenberry kind like Ruth is." "You are a very good kind, Billy," said Miss Hester warmly. "Oh, that's all right," returned Billy uneasily, moving off at the suggestion of a compliment. It was quite natural that Billy, the street urchin, should not appeal to Miss Hester in the same way as did Ruth, the daughter of a refined and gentle mother, though to sturdy Billy, Miss Hester gave a warm affection, while her sense of duty never allowed her to slight him or to lessen his opportunities. But it was Ruth who shared her future when she sat over her sewing planning for the days to come. It was Ruth whose love she craved, and of whom she felt that she could be proud. Billy should be reared to be self-reliant, that he might go forth into the world and make a name for himself. He should be sent to school, should have good moral instruction, and Miss Hester prayed that through her efforts he would become a good man. Ruth should stay with her and be as her own daughter, and one day they might go back together to the old home. At school, Billy not only held his own among his comrades, but fought Ruth's battles as well, so that no one dared so much as hint that she had not a right to her new name. That question came up one day, not long after Lucia Field's birthday party, for one day at recess. There was a great discussion over in one corner of the playground. Nora Petty and Annie Waite were contradicting each other, and Ruth, who was eating her lunch with Lucia, heard, "She has," from the one, and "she hasn't," from the other, repeated over and over again, the voices rising with the tempers of the two little girls who were quarreling. "What do you suppose is the matter?" said Lucia. "Let's go over, Ruth, and find out." So, with apples in hand, they crossed the playground. "There she comes now," said Annie. "You can ask her." "Oh, they are talking about us," said Lucia in a low tone. "Ask who what?" she said, as she came up. "Why, you know," began Nora. "This morning we had new copybooks given out, and we all had to write our names on them. I say, Ruth has no right to the name she wrote on hers, and Annie declares she has. Everybody knows Ruth's real name is Mayfield, and that it isn't the same as Miss Hester's, and that she isn't one bit of relation to her." "But it is her real name," cried Lucia, triumphantly. "That's the second time you have tried to hurt Ruth's feelings about it, and you've just got to stop it. She's my best friend. I'll have you to know. It isn't her name, either. It is, too. I reckon my grandfather knows. He told me the law gave her that name, and she is just exactly the same as if she were born with it, for Miss Brackenberry has legally adopted her, and if she ever gets back her old home, it could go to Ruth just the same as if she were her own child. So, there. I reckon my grandfather ought to know if anybody does." As Squire Field was the acknowledged authority upon most matters, Nora had not a word to say. She only stood and stared. The other children had gathered around. One of the boys nudged Billy. "Is that so?" he whispered. Billy nodded. "Sure, Pop. How about you?" "Oh, I'm not in it. She's a girl, and it's all right for her, and I can get along with any name. I told Aunt Hester I'd rather keep to Beatty, but I'd just like to see—" He spoke up in a loud voice. "I'd just like to see anybody, boy or girl, say that Ruth hasn't a right to be called Brackenberry. I'll make it hot for 'em." The girls shrank back, and the boys hastened to assure Billy that no one doubted his word. Billy had made good use of his fists for too many years for his fighting qualities to be despised by his schoolmates. "Come," said Lucia, putting her arm around Ruth. "Let's go back and finish our lunch. I've got some nice little spice cakes in my basket. I made the cook put 2 in for you." She glanced over her shoulder at Nora as she said this, for there had been a time when she and Lucia had eaten lunch together, but since her birthday party, Lucia had chosen to ignore Nora and had invited Ruth to share the enticing contents of her lunch basket. Everyone knew that Lucia Field brought nicer lunches than anyone else, and Nora felt herself distinctly snubbed. A great anger against Ruth arose in her heart. Ruth, whom she despised as an interloper and of whom she was wildly jealous. To be preferred before her was too much, and she determined that if there was any way to annoy her, that the chance of doing so should not be lost. Not long after this, her chance came, for on Friday afternoons, the little girls brought their dolls to school at the request of the teacher who gave sewing lessons upon that day, and who had cut out and put into the hands of each a petticoat, to hem, gather, and sew on a band. Ruth had learned to sew very nicely under Miss Hester's instructions, and made so neat a hem as to call forth the teacher's praise. "That is very well done," she said. "See, Nora, what neat little stitches Ruth has taken. Try to make yours look as well. I am afraid you will have to pick out half of what you have done. You are in too much of a hurry. If you want to sew neatly, you must take more time." Nora pouted and gave her shoulders a twitch as the teacher turned away. She did not dare say anything, but she gave Ruth so black and threatening a look as to make that young person wish she could change her seat, it being, unfortunately, next to Nora's. The best she could do, however, was to turn halfway around toward Lucia, who sat on the other side, and who gave Ruth a pleased smile when Miss Mullins praised her. Henrietta, though a less magnificent person than Lucia's Annabel Lee or Nora's Violetta was, nevertheless, quite as well dressed as her smiling neighbors who, staring at the maps on the wall, sat up stiffly on the desks in front of their several owners. Miss Hester, previous to the last Christmas, had given many a spare moment to the exquisite needlework which Henrietta's clothes displayed, and her dainty cambric underwear and pink frock were quite the admiration of Ruth's schoolfellows. To be sure, Lucia had excused the appearance of her doll by saying, "An only child as yours is, Ruth, must expect to dress better than the others. Now, with my 6, I find it hard to keep them all properly clothed, and sometimes they even have to wear each other's clothes. I can't get enough clean things to go around." Then little Ruth had embraced Henrietta tenderly, for she was indeed her only child, and her coming had been one of Ruth's greatest joys, for though she remembered her babyhood's dolls, these were all broken and lost long before Ruth had come to Miss Hester's to live, and a forlorn rag baby was her only plaything at the time her mother died. What had become of the rag baby, she never had found out, for when she looked for it that sad day when the good doctor took her for a last time to the empty attic, there was no rag baby to be seen. Possibly some even less fortunate child had found it and had treasured it. This, Miss Hester told her for her comfort, but because Ruth so mourned her lost darling, that first Christmas in the big house, Henrietta was given to her. Miss Hester had little money to spend even then, and the doll was the first thing taken from the old chest, which held the possessions of the little sister Henrietta, and which was destined to furnish Ruth with many comforts and pleasures. The doll, Henrietta, having been in the world some years longer than her neighbors, was rather an old-fashioned beauty. She was not of the biscuit of which the more modern dolls are made, but a sort of composition, and wax gave her a soft expression. Her eyes were large and beautiful, and her hair long and curling. Ruth admired her beyond measure, and because she was different from the rest, the girls all admired her immensely, and it was considered quite a privilege to be allowed to hold her. On this Friday afternoon, Ruth stole a pleased glance every now and then to Henrietta sitting in silent state upon her desk. Nora's doll in silk attire she did not think near so lovely, for Violetta had an unkempt, frowsy appearance. Lucia's Annabel Lee was a sweet, insipid creature with very light hair and an innocent smile which showed two of her tiny teeth. She was clad in blue cashmere, somewhat streaked and faded, from Lucia's attempt to wash the frock for this occasion. Her efforts had not turned out well, but as she confided to Ruth, it was clean, which was more than could be said of some costumes. Between two such representatives as Violetta and Annabel Lee, it was no wonder that Ruth viewed Henrietta with complacency. The room was very quiet, for the girls were not allowed to talk without permission. Once in a while, there was a subdued whisper from one corner, or Miss Mullins's low tones were heard as she bent over the work of some pupil. There was an odor of geraniums from the plants in the window. Sometimes, when a desk lid was raised, there was a sudden spicy whiff from a hidden apple. Outside, the sparrows were twittering in the vines, and the rumble of wagons sounded indistinctly. It was a very quiet, orderly class indeed, thought Miss Mullins. Suddenly, from one corner came a crash, a distressed cry followed by wild sobbing. Miss Mullins looked up, quickly. There was a disturbance in the direction of Ruth's seat. Miss Mullins went quickly to the scene of trouble. Crouching on the floor and holding fragments of a broken doll in her lap was Ruth, wailing, "She's dead, she's dead. She can never come to life again." "You shall have mine, my Annabel Lee," Lucia was saying as she placed her own doll in Ruth's lap. "No, no," wept Ruth. "I don't want anyone but Henrietta. There was only one like her in the whole world, and she's dead. She's dead forever." "Let me see, Ruth." Miss Mullins bent over the weeping child. "Perhaps she can be mended." She can't, sobbed Ruth. "She's all broken to bits." And indeed, poor Henrietta was in a very sorry state, for, though the body, legs, and arms were not injured, most of the head was a total wreck. "How did it happen? Did you let her fall?" asked Miss Mullins sympathetically. "No, I didn't do it. Nora pushed her off my desk on purpose." Miss Mullins straightened herself from her bending position. "Nora?" she said gravely. "Is that true?" Nora, looking honestly ashamed, hung her head. "I did knock her off, but I didn't do it on purpose." "But how came you to be meddling with Ruth's doll?" Nora was silent. "I had just taken her up for a minute," Ruth began to explain. "I wanted to measure the band around the waist, and I laid her down just for a second while I cut the band, and Nora leaned over and jogged her elbow just so, and Henrietta went sliding off before I could catch her." Miss Mullins looked again at Nora. "If that is true, it was a wicked thing to do, Nora, and I am greatly grieved that one of my class could purposely destroy another's doll." Nora began to sniffle and look aggrieved. "I didn't think she would break. I just wanted to scare Ruth." "You should have known that a doll was liable to break if it fell from any distance upon a hard floor, and in any event, you intended to do wrong. Even in trying to scare Ruth, you were to blame." Miss Mullins stood looking from the culprit to the mourning Ruth. "The only thing I can think of that you can do to make reparation is that you give Ruth your doll," she continued. Ruth scrambled to her feet. "Do you suppose I would take anything she had played with? Do you suppose her horrid Violetta could take the place of my dear lovely Henrietta? And I wouldn't touch that ugly, greasy old silk dress with that common cotton lace on it. I would be ashamed to be seen with such an untidy-looking thing. Ruth, Ruth." Miss Mullins's hand was laid on her shoulder. "This will not do. I realize that you are much grieved and excited, but you must not talk so. The only way Nora can make any sort of reparation is to give you her doll, and I want her to do it. She can send it to the heathen or the missionaries. I don't want it, and I won't have it. Miss Mullins, do you think your mother would want to change you for someone that looked like Nora's Violetta?" Miss Mullins tried to hide a smile. Ruth was so fierce and contemptuous, and, though she felt very sorry for her, she could not but be amused at the same time that she tried to be stern. "You must try to curb that violent tongue of yours, Ruth," she said. "I see nothing else to be done. I am sure we are all very sorry for you, and regret what has happened. I will excuse you from sewing any more today, and if you and Lucia will speak in whispers, you two may take that empty seat by the door, and I will give you permission to speak to one another, if you do not disturb the rest of the class. Nora, you may come to the platform and sit by me. I want to speak to you after school is dismissed." Bearing the fragments of her broken doll, Ruth made her way to the seat her teacher had pointed out, Lucia following with her own and Ruth's sewing materials. At sight of the unfinished petticoat, the tears welled up into Ruth's eyes again. "Henrietta will never need it," she sobbed, burying her face in her hands. Lucia put her arms around her. "Don't cry," she whispered. "You can have any of my other dolls if you don't care for Annabel Lee." Ruth gave her friend's hand a little squeeze. "You are awfully good, Lucia," she whispered. "I don't mean that your dolls aren't lovely when I say I don't want any of them, but you know there isn't any other one like Henrietta in the whole wide world. She isn't near so big as your Annabel Lee, nor so expensive, maybe, but she isn't like anybody else, and now I shall never, never see her again." And the tears flowed more plentifully. Lucia tried to whisper comforting words, though there seemed little consolation to offer. "You can have the petticoat for your Marie. It will just fit her," said Ruth after a pause. "I shall never need it." "Oh no, I couldn't take it," returned Lucia, though she secretly admired the neat work. "Please do. It will always remind me of this dreadful day, and I couldn't stand it. It is nearly done, you see, and I can easily finish it." So, realizing that Ruth really desired to give her the small garment, Lucia accepted it, determining that some day when time had softened Ruth's grief, she would again offer her one of her dolls. It was not long before school was dismissed. Then the girls gathered around Ruth with many expressions of sympathy for her and sharp censure for Nora. "I'd never speak to her," said one. "I wish I didn't ever have to see her face again," returned Ruth. "I don't see how you can bear to sit by her. She was always hateful to you." This from Annie Waite. "I'm going to ask Miss Mullins if Lucia and I can't change our seats," returned Ruth. But this she did not have to do, for on Monday, to her relief, she found Nora established on the other side of the schoolroom in a seat by herself, this being Miss Mullins's punishment for what she realized was a spiteful and cruel act. Ruth, escorted by a band of sympathizing comrades, bore her doll solemnly home that fateful afternoon and poured forth her pitiful tale in the ears of Miss Hester and Billy.